If your ink's too slow and your nib won't flow, here's one of the places that you can go. Larry is here to see you through with Mr. Announcer and Cubby too. It's Larry's Fountain Pen Reviews.
Oh, wonderful. I think today we're just going to be doing a sort of open session, a Q&A of sorts, and also we're going to be talking about my vintage pens. And I did a video with Larry before. I've done videos with Chris Rapseek as well, who also is a pen YouTuber that most of you guys should have heard of. And I've done interviews with both, so I highly suggest checking those interviews out if you want to hear more about my pen journey, I guess. And I've got a few pens to show you guys that I recommend as purchases for vintage pen enthusiasts and modern enthusiasts. I've got a few here as well. So we're going to be covering all the bases today. So we are going to be talking about how I got into vintage pens first. I think my beginnings were more so in handwriting rather than vintage pens in general. I've been writing cursive for years, almost 10 years, and I've always been interested in penmanship and improving upon my penmanship. And I thought there would be no better way than vintage pens. And also I'm an enthusiast in sort of classic items. So I thought having a vintage pen would be a sort of classic item that I could use every day. So one of the main interests for me at the time was preserving the antiques and the history of vintage pens. And the method I did it was first by just collecting some models that I thought were pretty nice and then branching out into restoring. So the first pen that really caught my eyes, if any of you guys know the Orange County Pen Club, that's my local pen club, and the LA County Pen Club as well. They, on their profile page, on their website, have one of these, a Parker Vacuumatic Golden Web. And this is one of my favorite pens. I don't know if you guys can see it clearly, but this is one of my favorite pens. And I've really enjoyed using it for, just handwriting and practical application. But at the time when I started vintage pens, I really set myself under a budget of $50. So I never got into this. So I purchased a pen with a similar color scheme, but also equally iconic, the Schaefer Balance in golden striated pattern from Tim's Vintage Pens. And from then on, I sort of explored and looked at some of the more iconic pens as well. After watching The Crown, the TV show, I got myself a Conway Stewart, of course. I also collected some. My first Parker Vacuumatic was from Antique Digger. I had this one restored because I had a friend's grandfather who passed away who also had a Parker Vacuumatic in Azure that he wanted it restored. So we got the two restored together, mine and his. I also had an Eversharp Skyline. At that time, I was collecting just to collect the pens that I like the look of pretty much. And I really like the look of the Streamline Eversharp Skyline. Since then, I've gotten many more of these. These are some of my favorites. Probably more than I should have. But that's the pen that, really inspired me to get into collecting and exploring vintage pens. And at one point, I reached out to Tim saying, "Oh, hold on a minute. Is there a way I can get into restoring pens?" And he said, "Yes, and I'll teach you how." So with Tim and also a really great restorer named Joel Hamilton and Rick Propus, who are all great restorers, and Greg Sheik, Antique Digger as well, they all helped me sort of craft my skills and get better and improve and really branch out of just collecting pens and getting to restoring pens. And that really kicked off my fountain pen business. In July 2021, I started Vintage Pen Co. USA, which is my fountain pen business. I'm sure many of you guys have either heard of it or seen my Instagram or Facebook. And collecting fountain pens is not really something that is that big of a hobby, whereas collecting vintage pens is even a smaller sect in the hobby. So even though I know that we are not the biggest hobby out there, what I really want to grow is that vintage pen portion of it. So getting a lot of people who are already into modern pens into vintage pens, I think is important, because it's really important to understand that legacy of the fountain pen and where it even came from, where all the modern ones like the Mont Blancs came from, or where the Conklins of the day came from, of today came from, which is the Conklin of yesterday, and the Parkers and the Watermans, which we see today. Where did those come from? So I really wanted to investigate that and learned the ins and outs of fountain pens through restoring all the vintage pens that I've come across and keeping many, but also passing that interest along to others by selling a lot of vintage novices, some pens, some people who are very into modern pens, who are experts in modern pens, some vintage pens like Dr. Vitolo here. He and I just talked about the Parker Vacuumatic because he figured he should have one, understand the legacy of the Parker Pen Company. So we've got the long history of fountain pens that actually just lasted a short amount of time in history. So I really want to preserve that amount of time where fountain pens saw their use and saw their widespread use instead of being a novelty item. So some of my favorite fountain pens are the Parker Vacuumatics, and Parker Pen Company in general. I can lift up my tray here to show you some of the Vacuumatics I have. I don't know if you guys can see these. Here we've got the Golden Web, and then next to it we've got an oversized, which I got on a trip to London. I met with some pen people. This is an oversized Vacuumatic in burgundy from the first generation with the double doors. We've got my majors. I really want to complete this major collection. And then we've got the Parker 51s, which are also some of my favorite pens.
Excellent pen.
Yeah, there's some excellent pens. And I always have Parker Vacuumatics for sale. I feel like it's always important for me to have some in inventory. That's literally policy for me at this point, is to have Parker Vacuumatics for sale. If I don't have them, I'll go get them to restore and sell, because that's the pen that I introduce a lot of vintage people to. So these are the three I have.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Question.
Yes, sir.
I'm not really don't know much about vintage pens. Just have a few. But the Vacuumatic is that there? It's not a lever filler, but that Vacuumatic speaks of what, the way in which you fill it.
Yes, and I'll show you actually. I think this is really important to cover because this is another item of pen history. So I've only been selling fountain pens for 10 months and only been into fountain pens for about 1.75 years now. But I think the really big part of my job is researching the history down to a T. I think knowing the history of fountain pens really well is something that'll really help you along in the hobby. So one of the things that I do is not only sell pens to people, but also tell them their history. So if any of you guys have checked out my Instagram, under every single pen, like this one I just posted, I'll put a long blurb of the pen's history beneath it and how it was restored and things like that. So I can show people pretty much that there's a history behind this pen and it's not just a product. So the Vacuumatic Filler, to get back to your question, is one of 3 things. So there were 3 iterations, and I have 2 of them with me right now. The first one is the way it fills. This is called a first generation Vacuumatic, where you twist it open here, and then it comes out, and then you pump it down, which creates a vacuum inside the pen, hence the name Vacuumatic. And then you twist it closed to lock it down once the pen is filled, hence the name Lockdown Vacuumatic Filler. and then you twist it back. This is a first generation green marbled Vacuumatic.
Mhm.
The more iconic Vacuumatic filler, I think, is this third generation pump filler, which is also found on Parker 51s, early Parker 51s, where you just pump the filler down to create the vacuum, which fills the whole barrel of the pen instead of just a sac. So this doesn't use a sac, it uses a diaphragm and it fills up the whole thing. Yeah, so I think Vacuumatics are some of the, like I said, I always keep them around. I have them in my own collection. I have them to sell because I always think if you're going to get a fountain pen from the 40s, it better be the Vacuumatic because not only do they hold a bunch of ink, they've also got this pretty unique celluloid, the striped celluloid. They've got wonderful fine nibs. They've got wonderful fountain pen sort of characteristics that we're looking for in every single fountain pen: durability, reliability, and beauty. And I think those are the three things that I'm looking for in a fountain pen. So that's why I always have them, because in my opinion, Parker Vacuumatics check all the boxes. And moving on to some other, very, very iconic fountain pens that I think everyone should own is Waterman. Waterman flexible nibs are some of the most sort of, I guess, technologically proficient and technologically advanced nibs, because I haven't seen anything that writes as good as these, even made today. I haven't seen any nibs with so much character, even today. So the vintage Waterman red ripples and the overlay pens are really nice. And I have one in my collection. This one is a 56 for sale right now. It's an expensive pen, but I think for the right person, it's really worth having. And like I said, Eversharp Skylines. Eversharp in general is a wonderful company. This is a Skyline I have in the darted pattern.
Mhm.
So this is quite an uncommon one with some of the most wonderful flex nibs as well. They've got excellent nibs that are quite flexible sometimes. I've got some that I've had bad luck with on the nibs and some that I've had great luck on with the nibs. And I think Eversharp, in terms of design, is one of my favorite companies because they did the best Art Deco pens, in my opinion. The Eversharp Dork is very good in terms of Art Deco design. This is my personal dork. I haven't really gone into restoring dorks yet, but a referral that I have for anyone looking for a dork restored is Joel Hamilton's sister, Cheryl, who is very good at restoring any sort of plunger filler, which is a pain to do. And this is a grail pen of mine, the Coronet, the Wall Eversharp Coronet, which is a very expensive pen, but it's the pinnacle of Art Deco design if you even look at the intricate detailing up there.
If
And
you
the
don't
cap.
mind, can you show the nib on that pen, please?
Yeah, the nib, I don't have the flexible nib, which is the adjustable nib, but it's just a manifold nib here. I don't know if I need to adjust the light for you to see that better. Repeat that?
Would that be a hard or soft nib?
Yeah, manifold nibs. I think we also want to define, as we're going along some of the vintage terms here, manifold nibs are nibs that were deemed as hard nibs and not flexible. A lot of the times what they were used for, they were also called accountant's nibs. They were used for writing in very small spaces, like accounting books, ledgers, or they were used to write through carbon paper. So they could leave enough of a stiff impression on the carbon paper to let it transfer through, when carbon paper was really something that they used all the time. Nowadays, since we have ballpoints, the stiffness doesn't matter because they're all stiff. But back then, that really mattered, because if you used a flexible nib and you had tines spreading out like this, and that just created a big 2 railroads on the sides of the paper, that wouldn't have looked nice on carbon paper. So you really wanted a stiff nib. And a lot of the times, that's why the Parker Vacuumatic and 51s were really popular, because their nibs, you couldn't flex them even if you wanted to on the 51. On the Vacuumatic, I've got lucky to buy some flex nibs and oblique nibs and things like that which is another beauty of vintage pens. There's a lot of nibs, but as the time went on, as carbon paper got really popular in the 40s, they stopped using flexible nibs, which led to the downfall of Waterman's nibs. And in vintage pens, it's so wonderful because you can get not only the different patterns, you can get the different nibs. And this is a pen. This is that oversized Vacuumatic. Sorry for the very poor lighting, but I don't know if you can see that nib. It is a oblique nib.
Mm-hmm.
That is a left oblique nib. So it's kind of like this. It's leaning to the left. And that's used for writing with a special angle, and it's a stub nib. So right now I have one of those, and it was made in Canada. But in terms of vintage pens, if you really look at the possibilities of the nibs, there's many, because people use these every day. They wanted something that fit them. It's like buying a watch. You want a watch that fits your style, your tastes, and you want it to do what you need it to do, tell the time or tell the date or things like that. And you want a pen that does the same. Back then, that was exactly what a pen was used for. And some other iconic pens, I think, is the Schaefer filling system, the snorkel filling system.
Yeah.
This is the PFM4.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the most beautiful pens ever made. It's definitely a pen for men, as they called it, because it was really big, really wide for the time, compared to the snorkel, which was, I guess, unisex at the time, if you could call it that. It was made for both men and women, which is thinner, bit shorter, uncapped. It had a smaller section. It was more comfortable for everyone to use, while this pen was really made for, businessmen or executives. And back then they also had different pen sizes, unlike many companies do today, whereas only Sailor is the one I can think of that makes different sizes of pens based on, large, medium, small. Mont Blanc does similar things. Pilot does similar things, but not as many pens really designated a pen for a type of person. While back then, Parker Vacuumatics made different sizes for different types of people. Like this was a debutante size, or actually it was a standard size, while this is an oversized. One was made for everybody. One was made for pretty much men only. So that's a different type of marketing from now and back then. This pen is much more substantial. And I think restoring pens is certainly something that's excellent to do. Fixing pens is really, really enjoyable to me. Right now, current projects that I'm working on is a complicated restoration, which is a custom Ariel Kulik edition. If any of you guys know Ariel Kulik, he's an Argentinian machiner who makes custom Parker 51s and custom Mont Blanc overlays, custom Parker Vacuumatics. So I just had the privilege of receiving a really nice sterling silver Vacuumatic. This is unlike anything I've seen, because this is a 925 pure sterling silver overlay Vacuumatic, which is extremely, extremely uncommon. And this is a grail pen for Ariel Kulik collectors, because the material itself is so expensive and the weight is so substantial. So right now I'm restoring this one, and it's a bit of a challenge, but that's what I'm doing. And there's just so many different unique pens, such as that one, that I've never seen before, that I get the privilege of restoring and bringing back to life. And, Ariel and I have talked about these pens, even though they were custom pens only made a number of years ago, or customized a number of years ago, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, there's still a history to them, like every single vintage pen.
Mm-hmm. What was the name of your website again?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram under @VintagePenco _USA. And I'm on Facebook as Aiden Chao. I'll put my name in the chat and you guys can see it there as well. Yeah, that's my Instagram. And recently, I've been doing restorations and sales, which has been quite a boon to my business, I guess, with a man named Kirby Allison. I don't know if you guys have heard of Kirby Allison. He is a sort of connoisseur of gentlemen's items, and he has taken up an interest in fountain pens. He used to do a lot of work with Goulet pens to do giveaways and such, but I really got him into vintage pens after meeting him, just, you know, since I was on Savile Row in London getting a suit done. He was at the same tailors. And, you know, I watched his YouTube videos for a number of years. He's very popular on YouTube with over 350,000 subscribers, I think. So he really has a presence on the internet, and he has been really sort of willing to spread the message of vintage fountain pens, which I think is very good for our hobby. And he's been, you know, quite helpful in spreading the word of vintage and talking about vintage pens and the benefits of them. And he's been he's a man of very refined tastes. If you look him up and see who he is, he's got great taste. So his benefit is that he can really tell me what works for him, what doesn't work for him. And he looks at vintage pens from the lens of style. So he really pairs it with all the suits he owns. For example, he just bought a new old stock gray Vacuumatic from me to pair with his, you know, charcoal and gray suits. And here, if you look his Instagram up, it's under the handle Kirby Allison, and you can really see his sort of vintage inspired looks. So he's really gotten into vintage pens as well. So I think it's really great that people outside of our immediate hobby have branched into looking into vintage pens. So, you know, there's just so many possibilities that are still ahead for vintage pens. And I think it's a great time to be a collector. It's a great time to be a restorer. It's a great time to get into it as well, to be a novice, because there's just so many different pens that are yet to be sort of appreciated in the vintage pen world. For example, the Esterbrook J. I don't know if any of you guys own an Esterbrook J, this pen. If you own an Esterbrook J, you know this thing's a tank. It won't break under any circumstances, and it's just about the most reliable thing in the world. This was actually the first vintage pen I've ever restored. This exact pen. And this pen was right now sells retail for about $50, $30 to $70, I would say, in that range, depending on the nib, depending on the condition, whatever. But this pen used to be considered junk by a lot of the vintage pen dealers. They would put it in a basket for you to take free at the pen shows. They thought it was junk and garbage. They didn't appreciate it like we do now. So a lot of the, you know, as the times have changed in terms of vintage pen collecting, the tastes have changed, the appreciation has changed, and now we have a much broader lens on what vintage pens can be and how good they are, regardless of price, regardless of nib material, etc. So there's endless possibility in what could become a classic, what can become a really nice vintage pen in the future, what becomes iconic in the future. So I think it's really beneficial that we're in a time right now where so many people are getting into it. And yeah, go ahead.
Is this the J that you're talking about?
Yes, exactly. And they came in different colors: green, copper, gray, blue, red, and black. See there, Frank's got, is that a red?
No, it's kind of a greenish, shiny.
Then Dan's got a green, and then Frank, I think, has a red, right?
I have a red one, yes.
Yeah, and I've got a gray one. So these pens are ubiquitous. I would really get one. I've usually got a few on me. Right now, I just sold out of them, but I'll always be getting them in. because they're, again, one of those pens like the Vacuumatic. I already say in terms of vintage pens, you want to take one out of three routes. One, if you really want to spend budget amount of money, $30 to $70 a pen, you want to go for Schaefer Balance or Esterbrook J. If you want to go from the $100 to $200 range, hands down Parker Vacuumatic. And if you want to go 200 up, let's say $200 to $500 range, I would suggest there your possibilities broaden. I would suggest either a Parker Royal Challenger. I think this is one of the most beautiful pens ever made. This is slightly over 500 right now retail, but this is my personal one. I just sold one as well. I would either go for a more special Vacuumatic. Let's say this one is a new old stock. So if you can see here, I don't know if you can see that. Let me use my phone flashlight because I really want to show you one of the features of Vacuumatics. You can see how the pen is transparent.
Oh.
Yeah, the pen is transparent. And this was one that's never been used before. So you can see how clear it is. Yeah, so this is a new old stock. This is slightly more expensive than the other vintage Vacuumatics because of the condition of it. But there's certainly all sorts of different vintage pens to get into. Watermans are really good if you want to get into that sort of higher end price. What you get is impeccable quality of an over 100-year pen. You can get a wonderful flex nib and something that'll last forever. So I think the quality of vintage pens, no matter the price, is they'll last forever because unlike modern pens, even though I know some modern pens like a Mont Blanc or a really special, let's say Mr. Cypress, which is a brand from Taiwan, I think I really recommend that. Dr. Vitolo definitely has a lot of Mr. Cypress and he can vouch for their quality. But those pens will last as heirlooms as well. But the thing about vintage pens that I believe sets them apart is you've got proof of that. You've got proof that this thing has lasted 85 years because it's here 85 years later. You've got proof that a Waterman's has lasted 120 years because it's still here 120 years later. So I think the special part about vintage pens is there's always a story to them. And there's always something that's you can discover about a vintage pen. And there's always something that is different about one vintage pen that will be different on another.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I think at this point, if you want me to keep going, Larry, we can keep talking. Or if there are certain questions that we want to take, we can take questions as well. Or Larry, you can ask me some questions as well. Yes, Dr. Joe?
Yeah, real quick. Thank you for doing this, Aiden. It's very informative. I've got to get going. I look forward to that pen coming to see me. What model did I get again from you?
So what you got is a Parker Vacuumatic,
Right.
3rd generation major, like this one in Azure.
Thingy, right?
Yes, with the
Great.
Vacuumatic.
Thanks, guys. I'll see you again. Thank you, Aiden.
Yeah, thank you for showing up.
Bye-bye.
Do you restore any European pens, vintage pens?
I haven't really gotten into European pen restoration. Since I live in the US, there's less of a purpose for me to get into piston filler restorations, vacuum filler restorations, Ono toes. I think the difference between that is it's just less accessible for me to get into. There's less people who really look for that service here. And most piston fillers in the US that you come across are new, like Mont Blancs. So that's not something that I've really sort of looked into doing. But if it's a Conway store or a lever filler or a Vacuumatic filler, then, or a button filler even, I can definitely do that. Yeah. I just haven't gotten into the European specific pen restoration techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, if anybody would like to ask him any questions, let's go ahead and open that up.
I'm kind of curious where you find replacement parts.
Yeah, so replacement parts come from a variety of different places. Sometimes I literally just scrap apart a pen that I deem worthy as a donor pen, because there's some pens which have really bad scratches on certain sections or certain parts that you can't replace or aren't replaceable to be worth it. So let's say I have a Vacuumatic, which, the nib is totally screwed up. What I might do is take a Vacuumatic that's missing a cap and pull that nib out and put it in here and save the rest of the pen as a donor part. Or let's say I'm missing a pressure bar. One of the best places to get parts is pentooling.com, owned by Dale Beebe. And he's got a lot of great vintage parts. For example, I just got a shipment from him today with the pressure bar for this beautiful striped duofold that I'm selling, and a bunch of sacks because I'm running out of sacks and diaphragms. So there's just a bunch of different places. 5-Star Pens is another one. I bet if you go to pen shows, you'll find a lot of donor pens and pen parts. There's plenty of different places with parts and such. Yeah.
Okay.
On the nibs, what are the size nibs on?
On vintage pens?
Yeah.
Well, vintage pens have many different types of nibs. For example, here I've got, like I said earlier, the left oblique stub nib.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, whereas this is a very, very wet, broad nib that's on this Royal Challenger. Whereas this is quite a dry manifold, fine, extra fine nib. Most of the pens that I sell are in the fine to medium range, but this Eversharp Skyline, for example, which is a beautiful black and gold pen. If anyone's interested in black and gold, I would really go for these ribbed gold Eversharp Skylines. This pen is a fine flex nib with great flex. Same thing with this Waterman Ripple and the sterling silver pen here. I don't have it restored yet, but I tested the nib out, and the nib is a USA Parker Vacuumatic flex nib, which if anyone knows about Parker Vacuumatics, a USA flex nib is much rarer than a Canadian one. So there's totally different amounts of nibs and nib choices and different amounts of flex that you can get in the nib and how they intake pressure and all sorts of different variables in nibs. But a lot of them weren't standardized sizes. They had them tuned, they had them customized. There were tens of different sort of sizes in the catalogs. So there were, it was all over the place back then. So every single nib you're going to get is probably going to be different.
Okay, anybody else out there? Now's the time. I know you can order the Esterbrook nibs as well. They have quite a few different.
Oh, yeah. You can get Esterbrook nibs of all different sizes. And what you can do with an Esterbrook nib, which I think is quite interesting, is unlike vintage pens that have, attached sections or push-in friction fit sections, these nibs just are attached to the section, and you can pull them out, put them in, put whatever your nib that you want in, and then you can get all sorts of different pens and combinations with Esterbrook's, which is great. And if anyone collects modern Esterbrook's, maybe you guys know about this. Modern Esterbrook's have an adapter that you can buy which takes vintage Esterbrook nibs. Yeah. So is anyone else collecting vintage pens? And I want to ask the crowd here, if anyone collects vintage pens, what do you guys collect? What's your interests? Because I know everyone has sort of a focus or an interest in terms of what they get.
I guess it just depends on how you define collecting.
Exactly.
I know that there's people out there that look for a specific thing they see online. They're like, oh, I want this. I want that writing. But then they go and they buy that pen and the nib isn't exactly what that showed in the video. For example, I have this here Waterman 12 POC, and it's an eyedropper, and the nib that came on it was very broad, and I got it from Mike Daigle.
Well,
And,
Mike Daigle's fantastic.
And the nib that came on it was very broad, and I asked Pierre Gustafson if he could send me a flexible, finer nib, and he sent me this one, and it's colloquially called Boinga Boinga. So, and I also have this other Waterman 12 that's like got a ripple. It's herringbone pattern, I guess, and it's got a very stiff nib, and the nibs look virtually identical.
Yeah, they're all different
Oh.
terms in terms of Waterman sort of specifications of the nibs.
So
Mike Daigle is, yeah, I just want to shout Mike Daigle out. He's also one of the people that I forgot to mention earlier. He's one of my mentors. He's taught me a lot about heat setting feeds. He's taught me a ton about restoring pens. He is one of those mentors that really got me into fountain pens. And this coronet, my Grail pen, one of them, is from him. So he sold me this one, came from Cliff Harrington's estate. So this is a really special pen, and yeah, Mike's been really helpful. So his flex nibs are always great, whatever he's got.
I only have one vintage pen for now. It's this I don't know if you can see it.
Schaefer Rose Glow,
Schaefer
is that what it
Balance.
is?
Open in the air.
Okay, I'm trying to. It's a Schaefer Balance, a little one. But what's special about it is the nib. It's not their standard nib, it's their feather touch nib.
Oh,
Soft nib. I absolutely love it. It's an extra fine, a lot of feedback, but it's a very lovely rider.
is it flexible?
No, but it's soft. It's very bouncy, unlike their other.
Oh yeah. See, I've got on my Schaefer, the first vintage pen I got is also a feather touch nib. Yeah. So, there's plenty of nibs that Schaefer made. And if you find a flexible Schaefer nib, that's a real find because they are usually pretty stiff, at least the balance nibs.
Yeah, balance nibs. Yeah, I don't see.
And
many
if you
that
find a
nib.
flexible nib on a snorkel, well, I'll be darned. Then that's a treasure.
I don't think that would be possible. My plan is I really want to get Parker Vacuumatic, Conklin Crescent number 40, and maybe Eversharp Skyline. Well, Eversharp Skyline.
Yeah, well, other than the Conklin,
Eventually.
I always hold Vacuumatics and Skylines because those are pens that I really enjoy working on. So I've always got these here. So I could definitely arrange for that to sort of happen. In terms of Vacuumatics, I really like, my preference personally is for either the first generations like these, because I like the lockdown in the marble color. This is a really nice pen.
Yeah.
It's not terribly small, even though it's a standard size. If you post it, it's quite a comfortable size. And I would actually be fine posting these because unlike the black shiny pens, let's say, don't post colors that, will show it. That's sort of my philosophy on posting pens. One, don't post something that will show the posting scratches. And two, don't post let's say this sterling silver pen, for example. Don't post that. Or two, don't post something with a very fragile material that will crack. Schaefer Balances come to mind. Eversharp Skylines come to mind. Don't post those. While Eversharp Dorks come to mind.
Do you repair cracks?
Yeah, huh?
Do you repair cracks?
I can. It's not something I like to do because of solvent welding, and I don't think it comes out as well as it should sometimes. So it's always a risk. But I would say there's some people that are more proficient in chemicals and solvent welding than I am. So I normally would refer that away from me, and because I do them, but they don't really turn out as pretty as I would like to or as permanent as I would like to because I use sort of a weaker solvent to prevent the risk of melting the pen.
Right.
But there are some people that are much more masterful at it. Yeah.
This shaper balance I bought, it had a crack in the lip of the cap. It only cost me $30 at the time. So it took me 2 years to find someone to repair. First person held it for a year and a half. There was a pandemic issue, and then he told me he can't repair it.
Yeah, that's a big problem. That's a big problem right now. A lot of people who do solvent welding have such a big backlog or just
it wasn't
aren't trying.
backlog. He couldn't get, he said, yeah, I could and all that, and he was going to, but then he said, oh, my supplier doesn't.
Supply chain issues to buy the solvents right now are a
Yeah.
big problem as well.
But I
So
found another guy.
it's a whole mess getting a crap
Southern
repaired.
Scribe, I think he called Southern Scribe. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yes, the Southern Scribe. Yeah, I know who I know of him. I've never talked to him, but I know who he is. I was considering getting a pen restored from him a long time ago, but once I learned restoring, I haven't really gone to him. I've really stuck with, in terms of getting pens restored, I've stuck with about 3 people. Tim from Tim's Vintage Pens, Tim Ettenheim. 2 is Cheryl Tyree, Joel Hamilton's sister, who repairs all my plunger fillers. And then sometimes Mike Daigle if I need some help with my own restorations, if I need some advice. But something like this Parker Vacuumatic, which also has pretty decent transparency through the marbling, is something that I would really recommend. This is a beautiful green marbled pen. And then, of course, regular Vacuumatics, silver ones as well. I really enjoy these. I've also got beginner pens. This Schaefer, definitely gonna run around $100, but no more than that. At retail, restored in good condition. So these are something, if you're looking for vintage pen and you like an extra fine nib, you like a fine nib, these are great. These Schaefers are really sharp. This one's super nice looking. You can post this one because there's a metal protector around it. There's a ring protector. And it's a perfect size for even my big hands. So, and it's got a beautiful fine nib on it. And Schaefer nibs, even though they're stiff and some people don't like them because of that, they're very fun to write with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yep, that's a beautiful one. That's a Schaefer. I want to say it's a Schaefer flat top. I don't know the number on it.
Flat on both ends. I've had this for a while. The only thing I've got like at local auctions that are like $5, $10, $15, And this one here, this nib that's on it, you probably can't tell very well.
Is it a 2-tone lifetime nib? Is that what it is?
It was a lifetime nib. I don't think it's 2-tone, but the thing is it was really not in good shape. I need to replace the nib. I tried smoothing it and it was already too short, so I've got it down to nothing left. Yeah,
see, the thing about vintage nibs is there's always some wear on them. That's the unfortunate reality of them. And vintage pens, like Dan has, the condition is king. Modern pens, you're buying it for looks, for nibs, for materials, because you know what it is. You know it's straight out of the factory. Frank Federalist Pens sells, he can definitely tell you this because he sells a bunch of, I bought some stuff from him before, I think, and, they sell wonderful pens, but they're all, straight from the factory, or even, I don't know if you sell slightly used pens, but they're straight from the factory. So, the condition, that's a given. Vintage pens, condition matters. So look at Dan's lifetime or Schaefer pen, right? Mm-hmm. Did you see how beautiful of a color that was? How it didn't have discoloration on it, as far as I can tell.
That's pretty good shape.
The fact that it doesn't have discoloration, or that it's perfect in terms of color, really bumps the price up compared to something that does. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in terms of Parker pens, let's say, you've got a Parker Vacuumatic that's ambered, yeah? And it's two of the same pen. Let's say this one. This is my personal brown Vacuumatic. If we shine a light on it, even though there's ink, you can maybe still see how there's a little bit of show through, but it's kind of red and ambered, yeah? Compared to this new old stock, same pen, absolutely the same pen, yet
Mhm.
you can see straight through it.
Mhm.
So condition is king for vintage pen. Whoever's collecting vintage here, unless you're buying them just to use them and just to enjoy them, if you're really collecting for the investment value or whatever, I don't really do that. I mean, I have some really nice ones in terms of condition, but I really go for anything that's presentable. Condition is really king. And I would really go for some stuff that's condition is great. This pen, people have literally been fighting over to take it out of my collection. I don't know if you can see that pen really well. Let me shine a light on it here. Let's see if I can get a light on this thing. I don't know if it presents well on camera. Unfortunately, it doesn't do it justice. Maybe this will do better. Do you see the brilliant color on this one?
Mhm.
And how that's straight through transparent?
Mhm.
This Azure Parker Vacuumatic. This is a pen people have literally been fighting over. And I got a really good deal on it. I got it for under $100, but you can see how this is just straight through. That's just perfect.
Mhm.
And this Azure Vacuumatic I got for $100, but if someone really, really collected these retail price, because I restored it, this thing would sell for over $250, $300 because of how good it is. It's a new old stock, so it's perfect. Never been inked before, never been used before. So that's just a condition difference. And that's a big deal in vintage pens, unlike modern pens. So that's one of the variables that you really consider. In terms of modern pens, you really don't care how condition, is impacted, because condition is always the same unless there's a factory error or you're buying pens used. But in terms of vintage, everything is used unless you've got new old stock.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now, what year was that pen? When did it come out?
Yeah, see, the benefit of Parker pens is there's always a date code on it. So this one, if I look at it closer, I think it says 5. So this came out in 1945, the year that World War II ended. So here's something that's never been used since World War II ended.
Hmm.
And that's just the marvelous history
Yes, it is.
of vintage pens. And all Parker Vacuumatics, if the date code is present, you can date them. Same thing with early Parker 51s, you can date them. Same thing with Royal Challengers, dual folds, striped dual folds, not the big red dual folds or those types, not the flat tops. But you can date most of them. Yeah.
So are the nibs scratchy? Are they smooth? Are they wet, dry, what?
Depends on the pen. I've got all of the above. Some nibs, I don't like as much, even though they're very unique, like this one. I've really had to fight this nib because even though sometimes it's wet, most of the times it's dry and scratchy, maybe because it's a left oblique and I don't hold my pen that way. But I have it to have it. I mean, this is a grail pen of mine as well, to have such a nice oversized pen. But overall, it is a bit scratchy, and sometimes you can't do anything about it. But always you can. Same thing with my other grail pen. I've had bad luck on my grail pen nibs, or at least in terms of how I like my nibs. I like them quite broad and wet. This one's quite fine and scratchy, but I can deal with it because it's a grail pen and it's still a fine writer. All vintage pens are good writers, for the most part, actually, but some are just quite scratchy. Others are really, really smooth. My Parker 51s are some of the smoothest writers I have. This Wall Eversharp Dork is very wet, medium, smooth. My Parker Vacuumatics, all three of them are fine. They're pretty smooth and they're pretty wet. And I think that's the trend with Parker Vacuumatics. They're medium flow to wet flow, whereas Schaefer's are drier flow, whereas Watermen's are they're very, very wet. Waterman's, yeah, they're crazy wet. Except if you get a Waterman's accountant or manifold nib. Other than that, they're almost always going to be flexible and wet or broad. And Skylines, these are all over the place. You sometimes have the really stiff ones. Sometimes you have the very, very wet and flexible ones. I've got both in my collection, actually. Sometimes you have the super dry ones. But I would really just collect vintage pens based on, I usually put the look first, then comes the nib. But other people, they buy for the nib and then go look for the looks. So they can have a third tier pen with some of the best nibs. So vintage pens, it's all over the place in terms of that.
Do you recommend any certain inks for these pens?
Certain inks? Well, let's just talk about the inks to stay away from. The ones I would stay away from are any boutique inks. Boutique ink, by boutique inks, I mean inks that are made from very small batches that aren't controlled, in terms of large scale production. And this is not a unanimous decision. This is just, in my opinion, what I think is safe or not. There are certain inks that I would stay away from, like Birmingham inks, Noodler's inks, because they're made in such small batches. And I think there's some let's say like some Chinese brand inks I wouldn't put in pens, just no name inks. I wouldn't really risk it. I wouldn't put any alkaline inks in the pens, like Pilot Eero Shizuko, stay away from it. Sailors, stay away from it, because they can hurt the sacks, which is a big problem with vintage pens. I would stay away from red inks in general, unless you commit to putting it into a pen, just in general. Like I have Mont Blanc red ink in this Vacuumatic because they're really hard to clean out. Vintage pens are not easy to clean out. I would really go for Waterman's, Parker's, Schaefer ink, Diamine ink. Diamine's one of my favorites, and Mont Blanc. In Pelican, I would go for those brands, the legacy brands, as I would call them. I really recommend Diamine. Frank can probably comment on this. I saw he was filling up ink vials too.
Thank you. Thanks, Aiden. Yeah, good seeing you. Good meeting you finally.
Yeah.
No glitter inks in vintage pens.
Agreed.
They're not made for that.
No shimmer, no glitter.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Most of what you said is right. Yeah. Sailor is pH balance is different. So Sailor even says don't mix Sailor with other Sailor inks. You don't mix Sailor inks. Noodlers, because of being high saturated. Yeah. Diamine, Edelstein, J-Urban, stable, good pH.
J-Urban, I've never used a J-Urban ink. I really got to get one, but I know their inks are very, very safe, except for their shiny inks. Don't use Emerald de Chavour and
not the anniversary exactly, but the standard.
But the standard J-Urban, let's say Lidate, the Napoleon artillery green, I think that's an ink. The black, the noir or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
The Pearl Noir.
Yeah.
Pearl Noir. All those inks are perfectly fine for vintage pens. Highly recommended. The companies that have been making inks for hundreds of years. And I also want to add a side note here. If you want to risk it, and actually I think it's safer if you get a nice bottle of vintage Schaefer Script ink. I recommend vintage Schaefer Script or vintage Waterman ink. Check it first. See if it doesn't smell funny. See if there's no mold in it. See if it's still all liquid. I would use that. To test every single vintage pen I sell, if you look at my Instagram, to the last page of every pen, I don't know, does Marilyn follow or Robert or whoever? If you go all the way to the back of my posts, you can always see I have a writing sample. And they're always done in a dark blue ink. And that dark blue ink is a bottle of Schaefer Script from the 1950s that I dip test because they're just so easy to clean out. There we go. The screen sharing should probably show this off very well. There we go. That's my newest post, and you can see how I do my writing samples.
Looks like blue black to me.
Yeah, it's a blue black. That's exactly what it is. Schaefer script blue black vintage ink from the 50s, and that's as close as you're gonna get to the pen's age.
Yeah, the one ink, vintage ink you shouldn't use is Parker
Super chrome. Super chrome.
Super
Yep.
chrome, yeah. Just like
So that's why I said Schaefer and Waterman, stay away from Parker. Don't risk it with any Parker inks. What I would actually do is collect the Parker bottles. I really want to get myself one of those diamond bottles that Parker used to make, or the old clink bottles. Maybe empty out the inks, or buy one that's empty, but don't try to use the old Parker inks because they're really not good for your pens. They'll rust them out from the inside out. Yeah, so I think in terms of inks, there's still plenty of options, as Frank was talking about. There's plenty of options with vintage to use, and there's a limitless sort of combination of ink and pen that you can go for. So I don't think you're even limited not buying the Iroshizuku inks or not buying the Sailor inks, because there's so many substitutes to those.
Mm-hmm.
Should you commit to using one ink in a specific vintage pen?
Well, yes and no. If there's an ink that I think really matches a pen, like this really matches. I don't know if any of you guys, I was just on a trip to London, as I said. I went to get some pens and some inks. I was at the Mont Blanc store, and I got a bottle of Year of the Tiger ink. If anyone's heard of that, the Year of the Tiger ink is their red orange sort of what would you call that? Their limited edition Chinese New Year ink. And I put that in this pen because it matches really well. In my brown pens, I guess I stick with the rule. What the color of the pen is, I color code the ink. So for this brown pen, all my brown pens, I try to put brown ink. Diamond Macassar is my favorite brown ink. In all my blue pens, I pretty much put Diamond Oxford Blue. I like dark inks, so I put Diamond Oxford Blue in my blue inks, or in my blue pens. Green pens, I have a choice now because I have two green inks. In the darker green pens, or for the green, like proper green pens that are green colored, I like to put Mont Blanc Irish Green, or Schaefer, or not Schaefer, Diamond Green Black is a very formal green black ink. And I put green ink in my black pens as well for some reason. I don't know why. Gold pens, I either put blue or brown. Gold, I can do whatever I want, really. Burgundy pens, red pens like this, I usually always put Oxblood or Macassar, brown ink, something like that. Silver pens, anything metal colored, silver pens, I try to put, usually I would say blue ink, Diamond Oxford Blue. I think that's my favorite ink, Diamond Oxford Blue.
All right, folks. Any other questions before we?
Yeah, Larry, repeat that.
Yeah, we're at the top of the hour. So anyone have any other questions? Mike Green or Robert, do you have any questions? You not had a chance to speak yet?
Yeah, Mike, you make custom pens, right?
Yes, I do. I don't have many vintage pens yet. I'm interested in what you've been saying, though. So I'm kind of really. I think a Vacuumatic would be interesting to try sometime.
Yeah, I think, Mike, I've seen your pens. I really admire the work you do. I really like some of the materials you use, but the difference between the materials of your pens, which are mostly resin, I would say, right? Resin or wood.
Most of them are resin. I have been doing some ebonite as well.
Yeah. See, the difference in that sort of, I guess, realm of pens is back then there weren't poured resins. Everything was celluloid that was stacked and cut into blinds. They weren't poured into a mold and then turned on the lathe. They were stacked or, melted together and then cut into blinds.
Or ebonite.
Or ebonite, yeah, which was turned into blinds and poured as well. That was poured, but they're mainly sort of the materials are stacked on Vacuumatics, and I think that would be quite unique to get a hold of because they're different than what you make because they're not sort of free flow designs. They're quite concrete in terms of how they're made. Whereas Mike's pens, if you look at them, they're beautiful. A lot of them are swirly patterns, whereas Vacuumatics are either marbled or stacked. And I think having a stacked celluloid would really, really be something fun for you since, Mike, I know you admire pen materials since that's what you do. That's the field you work in terms of pen making. You really explore those materials.
Right. It looks good.
Yeah, and Vacuumatics are something that are wonderful. I think you would really enjoy I know your pens are slightly larger, but I think you would enjoy a marbled Vacuumatic because this is something that modern pen makers no longer make. This sort of this marble color. I haven't seen a single modern pen maker make something like this in quite a while with the transparent barrel as well, incorporating that in there. And I also haven't seen a stacked celluloid except for some very minimal limited edition pens from Italy that don't even do it as well, in my opinion.
All right, well, there you have it. All right, folks, we're going to cut it off today, and we're going to bring you back again soon. How about that?
Yeah, I think that'll be wonderful. I mean, it was great seeing everybody. It was great being able to talk about the collection. If there's any last minute comments, I would love to take them.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I mean, everyone's got the contact information right now. Marilyn was very kind to put the link in the chat to see what I've got. On my Instagram is where I post almost every single pen that I sell. There's some that I miss, of course, but most pens I take pictures of them and post them. For example, this is an upcoming sneak peek for you guys. This is a pen I just took a picture of and I'm about to post. If you know vintage pens, you know this one. This is the Parker 51 Double Jewel in Mustard. One of the rarest colors. And there's, all sorts of different vintage pens. I have, this is a sneak peek. If anyone's interested in this very, very rare vintage pen, what this is, like I just said, is that sterling silver pen. This is really rare. It's wonderful. But if anyone's interested in these types of things, let me know. If anyone's interested in a restoration of either a lever pen, a button pen, or a Vacuumatic pen, let me know. It was great talking to everyone today. It was great, being able to cover the history of vintage pens and the ones I do and listening to your questions and comments as well. I think we really had a great chat and I hope everyone has a good weekend. And like I said, if you guys ever need vintage pen sort of help or collecting, advice or pens that you're interested in, let me know. I'll be very happy to oblige.
Okay, my friend. Well, thank you very much. And everybody, thank you for joining us today. And we'll see you again soon. Take care, y'all.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.